Good evening. We're going to spend a little bit of time in this video understanding a bit about your final project and also spending some time talking a little bit about what research is. Now, the first thing that you have an opportunity to look at is your template online. So I want to take just a few minutes to talk about that template. Now, it's a nice process, and the one thing that I want you to remember is that when you are using a template, you still morph the template, you keep within the formatting, but of course you make it designed to your particular project. Now, at the very top, it gives you a table of contents, and I want to break that down very briefly and trying to keep these videos short. First, the executive summary. Executive summary, like any other summary that is dealing with this type of approach, is a high-level view of your overall project. So even though it leads, just like a business plan, it is the last thing that you write. Now, you will put some of your executive summary here, and it will be expanded when you finish your second series of courses with me and you complete your final project. So your executive summary is the last section you'll fill out this term before you submit your final project and do your final presentation. The next section is talking about what your project or purpose is. What's the justification? And when it comes to business, we have to look at this from an approach of need. And in our first video, I talked a little bit about how it's very much like marketing, that when you purchase a product, you purchased it because we're fulfilling a need for you. We have to decide what is the dilemma that we are trying to resolve. And the second series of 5-week courses that we have will talk about an in-depth breakdown of return on invested capital. But in essence, we have to think about the business need. Again, tons of research can be done, and it can be external research that will help you focus. But for the scope of this project, we have to find something that fills a business need. So within that need, we have to start thinking about what is the company's mission? What's the company's vision? So that we fall within that. The need also has to be aligned with their goals, their benchmarks, their basic deliverables that are part of their long-term strategic plan, their objectives. A lot of times we can look at it from a QM point of view. So when we think about the need and what we're fulfilling, quality management is about Kaizen, slow, steady improvement. And from that approach, there are multiple things that we can resolve, whether it's saving time, and time in essence does save money, whether it increases efficiency, whether it reduces a process, therefore reducing a cycle of time. We have to think about how we can fulfill the need. So we want to talk about what justifies this particular project. And remembering, this project is something that you are going to work on for the company that you're currently employed with. It will have to be signed off and approved, and we'll talk about ethics in the next chapter. But the one thing to remember is without authorization, it's not legitimate research, at least for a corporation standpoint or a company standpoint. So make sure that somebody gives you approval to do this. What are some of the issues that you may come into? Some of the issues may be that not as much support from the organization. You also aren't doing it from a team approach. And a lot of times when we look at an issue that we want to resolve, believe it or not, our mind has already decided what the result will be, what we should do, without even doing the research. And that's the option of using a team, because it keeps you focused when those aha moments come up, and it keeps you with where the research takes you, not necessarily where you think this is going to end up. We talked about time. Time is an issue, so keep track of that, because we don't want this to blow up into something larger than you actually have time to do for research, and time is critical. Anytime you're doing research within an organization, there's always bias or concern about whether there is company history or resistance to change, and that's always possible. Don't let that deter you from doing your research. It's very important. Again, making sure that we show value, fulfilling the need there. Now, the second portion is talking about your project description, and that is basically talking about your success criteria. What are the requirements that are going to be needed to be successful within this particular project that you're doing. It wants to talk a little bit about constraints. Now, constraints are things that we just mentioned, issues, and we could spend a good hour talking about all of the issues that may constrain you, but time, of course, being your number one. We have assumptions. What are the assumptions that you make when you're working on this project? And don't forget that we have to have a good research question. And in a few chapters, we'll talk about what a good, legitimate research question is and how to design and break one down. When you're putting together a good research question, and that is talking about your preliminary scope statement, I want you to think about a term called scope creep. And it's very important when you're designing your question and something that you're going to research. I want you to think of it very similar to starting a home project. And initially you were maybe going to paint. The next thing you know, you've knocked down a wall, you've replaced carpet, and it's turned into a massive remodel project when it was something very simple. That's in essence what scope creep is that you continue to add to the research and add more avenues. And unfortunately, not only is that difficult and outside the time frame that you have, but it's hard to refine a solid answer when your project has become larger than we can actually research one level at a time. And from a qualitative standpoint, that's extremely important because we're looking at, again, slow, steady improvement. And when we think of cycles, that can be a Deming cycle, or it can be from a Six Sigma standpoint, a PDCA. And any research that you do, whether that is 4 steps, 5 steps, 6 steps, and the 4 steps is like PDCA, plan, do, check, act. The process is that we have an issue, and anytime you are working on that and doing your research, think about going out to your car and you turn the key, nothing happens. We immediately have a problem. So we devise a plan. For many of you, it's a different avenue. Some people might say call AAA. Some people might say call someone that knows, or call a mechanic. My process would be the battery is dead. And so the plan will be to get jumper cables, a second vehicle with a battery, and then to actually devise the plan to make that happen, measure it. How do we measure that? Everything that we do in research and everything that we do in business has to have a measurement to it. We'll spend a lot of time at the end of this term and into next term talking about things that we can actually measure, and that's very important. Our measurement in this is only a yes or no. It's almost a null hypothesis, and the null hypothesis we'll talk about in the next chapters 2 and 3. But in essence, when we hook up the jumper cables, that's our check, that's our action to measure. Only one of two things is going to happen. The vehicle's going to start, or the vehicle isn't. And the process from that is that that's a complete research cycle. And notice that we narrowed down the scope. If that did not work, we would start a new cycle of research. And in essence, each time you do a problem or a research cycle, it can be one of two things. It can be an ongoing process where if that did not work, that might be your first series. And we'll get into qualitative and quantitative and mixed methodology soon, and that kind of explains the process there. Now, within the scope of that, we have to start thinking about what our tactics are. And they talk about a few tactics that you can utilize in your book. And that is covered between the first chapter in pages 5, 6, and 7. And there are some things that we have to consider in terms of where are we gaining our sources of information. And that's very important. And your book calls it BIS, or Business Information Systems, and it gives you a nice chart. And I'm looking at it here, and we have to think about where we're getting our information. And it talks about everything from demographic to government intervention, and we always have to consider that, considering not only our mission and our vision or our strategic plan, but we have to start thinking about, are there any laws or compliance issues that are coming up? And a quick example of that would be several years ago when the ability to have free Wi-Fi was a government regulation that came In other words, a wireless provider could not charge you for something that you could download for free. Therefore, Verizon, who used to charge $5 to $10 a month for that service, had to adjust that. Well, they had millions of phones out there with that service. That was a loss of revenue that they should have anticipated and had something in replacement for that particular stream. And so anytime we're doing research, that's part of that. Do we have issues there? Competitive rivalry, and we're thinking about marketing and Porter's 5 forces. Well, we're always looking at our competition, whether that is from strategic planning or from operations development to even HR and how we are doing our hiring process. You have to think about economic factors, and a project may be massively successful in what we have gained and learned. It doesn't necessarily mean that we can actually do that. So we have to decide, even if it's a new product or a new cycle. In other words, we're thinking about the product life cycle and we're going from our intro growth and we hit to maturity and decline. Right as we hit its maturity, we should be launching our next cycle. Well, that has to make sure that if we've come up with the next upgrade, we don't have to completely reinvent the wheel. But if we come up with our next upgrade, can we afford it? So we have to work with our research development, we have to work with manufacturing and engineering and design team to make sure that we can afford it, and also is it tangible? So even though you may have come up with the next great thing, can your customer afford it? So we have to think about economically, can we afford it? Can our customer afford it? Cultural and social changes are something that always impact an organization, and diversity is extremely important. So that is part of the process that you need to look at in terms of changes in organizational behavior and also social systems in terms of what you are trying to create, always within what your organization's model is. We have to consider policies and procedures and practices. And the one thing about being a consultant is sometimes you may have to go against the grain there if you're making a change. But consider a few minutes ago that you may have bias and resistance. So think of open lines of communication. Why you have approval on this project. Why? Because it opens up lines of communication. We have to think about demographics and the technology that's available. All of those, of course, are part of your product description, some of the assumptions that you might make in your preliminary scope statement. Risks. We'll talk more in Chapter 2 about the risks that can be involved and the ethics. But remembering in this particular project, we're trying to minimize the risks. But you do have to consider in the process, what are the risks? And the risks can be anything from the organization to the project itself and to those that are participating, because you are going to be doing both probably a qualitative from an interview standpoint to a quantitative and survey standpoint. And where are we gaining that information from? Is it direct? Are we using corporate reports? Are we doing the survey local? Are we using second tier information? Where are we gaining this? Or a combination of both. So we have to consider that. We have and it gives you a nice chart in terms of deliverables and milestone schedules. Time is important, so look at that and be very clear on each step what you are going to achieve in this project. That is very, very important, because any project you have someone you answer to. In this particular case, it does happen to be myself, but in your case, if it was a business project, we always have deliverables, dates that we have to achieve, and that keeps us on track so that we don't go outside the scope or expand our research too large, or we realize there's something that you've heard before, analysis paralysis, and that basically means you're looking for more information, searching and gaining more information. Sometimes you just have to make a call that we have enough information. We have to gather that information, and we have to make a determination as to what we are gaining from that. There's a summary budget. Now, in your particular case, unless you are on an ongoing project that just started, and that is going to be your research scope, or it's something that you are starting now with a problem, and you have to start realizing issues that your company has and things that you can resolve. We have to minimize the budget. Again, your time, you can factor what your time would cost, but it again is basically zero. Summary budget also is something you might share so that when you ask, hey, can I do a few interviews? Can I conduct a survey? Find out how long it'll take to get the survey done so that you can show them it's very minimal in terms of what it's costing the company for you to do this particular research. Change management and communication. multiple ways that we can create change. There is, I'll kind of keep it very simple. You have what you would call a forced change or a process change. And any of you that have gone through a change in an organization, they're very clear that when they walk in the door, they say, here's the new process, we're giving training on it next week, we'll implement it the following week, and we'll have new goals and designs for that. That's a forced change. You didn't know it was coming, and here it is. You have to deal with it. And that's where you start to get some resistance there. Now, from a Kaizen approach, and again, you're going to hear me utilize qualitative management a lot, open lines of communication and slow, steady improvement, we have to find a control. And once we have a control, something we can gauge, then we can find steady improvement to refine that. Well, that refinement generally comes from your employment group. So if you have open, clear lines of communication, if you were part of that change, if you had been asked what would be a better software design system that you could utilize or a new customer service approach that you could utilize, and you had input, and as a group you came up with this, you would be excited, you'd be ready to go because you were part of that process. An example, Toyota, 3 million employee suggestions every year. 3 million. That's a massive amount of employee suggestions. And again, we're not talking huge changes. They're looking at the cycles and how they can make small, steady improvements. We're not talking about a Kaizen blitz, just Kaizen, slow, steady improvement. Of those 3 million employee suggestions, they implement over 2.4 million of them. Why? Because they're showing and refining and making things better. So tell us what your change management will be. Let's say that you research an issue, you find that it will be successful. You have shown that not only is it saving money, it's increasing efficiency, it's giving a better product to the customer with a better service. All of that, any of that, is a benefit to the organization. But how do we make that happen? Just because we come up with a result, we have to explain to them how we're going to make this work and how we are going to communicate that to our employees. Let's say that it's a new process. How are we letting them know? How are we getting them trained? Because that also, down the road, will be something that takes budget and time. And training, by the way, and this isn't a long training session in this section, but you have to truly think, training is an expense by most companies' thoughts, but that's not true. Training, like anything else, is an investment. So you have to find a way to reflect why and how we're going to train someone and the benefit long-term from that. You'll have a section for project requirements, and then you'll have anything in your appendices. So make sure that you keep all of that, whether that is questions that you have set up for the future, the type of research, and of course all of your reference and research material at the end. Everything goes in with your references first and your appendices coming at the end of this. And that's stage one. And ultimately, when you're doing research in a project, that's what we're looking at. Simplicity, we do an overview of the project. We explain what the problem is. We have research into that problem. We talk about what is our approach, how are we going to create this research, and of course what is our methodology here. That's the first step. What's the issue? Refine the issue, the corporation's or company's involvement in that, how we are going to conduct our research, any of the costs in setting milestones. It is in the time frame between now at the end of this term and the beginning of the next class where you should be doing your research, doing some interviews, getting your survey launched, because that takes time. And I can't stress enough that the more proactive you are, even though there's a class in between, the easier the last 5 weeks will be. These tie hand in hand, and that break in between is specifically to get some of that research done. And so it's an ongoing project, and at the next class you'll be delivering what you've learned and where you go from there. So that's a little bit of what your final project is like and some things and tactics that you want to utilize. I want you to read through Chapter 1. It talks a bit and breaks down some of the management dilemma, some of the tactics that you have coming up, and thinking about it truly from a component of your project. I want you to have, again, a wonderful evening. I'll look forward to speaking with you directly one-on-one, and you will have following videos for chapters 2 and 3 and so on. I want you guys to have a great day. Take care.